So in the book that Dorothea just mentioned, I've done my best to show that Love's Labour's Lost was primarily about Russian-English relations, and that Shakespeare knew about Russia more than we previously thought. Since their initial encounter in 1553, until the publication of Love's Labour's Lost in 1598, England and Russia have been involved for 45 years in an exchange full of intense and often comical attempts to forge political alliances and dynastic ties. Russia was unpopular with many European countries, but it had a friend in England. This friendship was based on Russia's need for arms and England's need for a new market for its woolen cloth. Queen Mary began this friendship, this relationship, and passed it on to Elizabeth to continue with all its ups and downs. In my talk today, I want to show that Love's Labour's Lost could have only been written by Edward de Vere. But to do that, I have to drag you down another rabbit hole of history, this time Baltic history. The 17th Earl of Oxford was a close observer of Anglo-Russian relations since his childhood. And this was due to his father's and his father's associates' involvement in them. Oh, so that was my book. So Osip Nipeya, Ivan the Terrible's first ambassador to England, arrived in 1557 and was lodged in the house of a wealthy merchant, John Dimmock. Dimmock was an exporter of cloth, an insurer of ships, and a ship owner himself. He owned the ship on which Nipeya sailed back to Russia in the summer of 1557. Dimmock is referred in one source as a servant of the 16th Earl of Oxford. In 1558, Russia invaded Livonia, present-day Latvia and Estonia, starting the very long Livonian War. Besieged by Russian troops, the citizens of Livonia appealed to Denmark and Sweden, an old-time enemy of Russia. Parts of Livonia were offered to Scandinavian royals in exchange for stopping Russia, which was equipped with the latest technology that Ivan was buying in England. I believe it was these geopolitical tensions and trade incentives that opened the floodgate of marriage proposals to young Elizabeth from the Swedish and Danish princes, Eric and Frederick. The Danish proposals were very short-lived, but the Swedish ones were frequent and very persistent. They began to arrive in 1557 when Eric, the king-elect, sent his tutor Dionysius Boreus to deliver his first marriage proposal, and his visit enraged Queen Mary. As soon as Queen Mary was gone, Eric enlisted the help of his half-brother, Johann, the Duke of Finland. The young Duke arrived in early October 1559 and stayed until April 1560. He was met by John de Vere, the 16th Earl of Oxford, who spent all his time with the Duke, taking him hawking and, I quote, showed him good sport, end of quote. Johann also spent much time with Sir Thomas Smith, Edward de Vere's personal tutor. In his letter to William Cecil, Smith reported just how much the young Duke of Finland enjoyed the company of the 16th Earl of Oxford, and that no one could have done a better job entertaining a foreign prince than did the 16th Earl. Johann was offered a very good deal in Livonia, but he needed England to support him financially. So personal interest superseded brotherly love, and instead of carrying forward his brother's suit, Johann proposed to Elizabeth himself. He spent a small fortune in England pursuing his goal of marrying Elizabeth. However, as the Spanish ambassador put it, he left for home, I quote, with cold comfort, end of quote. While Johann was in England, Elizabeth showed him solidarity with Sweden by putting on 2 masks whose texts are now lost, but whose title indicate to me that they were about Russian troops in Livonia. After Johann's departure, masks that mocked gullible Swedes were played at court. Elizabeth's astute use of theatre to direct her foreign policy was already evident during her first Christmas of her reign. After Johann returned home empty-handed, his brother Eric, no longer trusting his half-brother, decided to sail himself. Having done such a brilliant job hosting the Duke of Finland, the 16th Earl of Oxford was now tasked by Elizabeth with meeting and hosting his half-brother Eric. Eric was about to embark in late September 1560, but just as he was about to go on board, he learned that his father, King Gustav Vasa, died, and he had to return to Stockholm to secure the crown. Eric didn't make it to England second time either. It was reported that while he did set out in very bad weather, strong winds prevented him from completing his journey. He gave up and went back home. The war in Livonia continued, and so did the pressure from Eric to marry Elizabeth. In 1561, she sent to England one of her top noblemen, Niels Sture, who delivered Eric's portrait, painted by Stephen van der Meulen, the painter whom John Dimmock brought from England to Sweden specifically for that purpose. But Elizabeth wouldn't commit either way. However, when she learned that Eric also proposed to the recently widowed Mary, Queen of Scots, she pretended to be interested. The 16th Earl of Oxford was involved in this back and forth for many years. In fact, in August 1562, the month of the Earl's death, John Dimmock, his servant, was in Sweden advising Eric on how to win Elizabeth's hand. To young Edward de Vere, Russia thus presented itself through the prism of its relations with Sweden. And Elizabeth's being between a rock and a hard place, because she was between Eric of Sweden and Ivan of Russia. Edward de Vere witnessed all this political and amorous frenzy, which continued after his father's death. In 1565, Eric's sister, Cecilia, this is another envoy, the same year, 1561, this is Niels Guildenstern that also arrived to help Eric marry Elizabeth. But in 1565, Eric's sister Cecilia arrived in England, and she urged Elizabeth to consider the marriage with her brother. She stayed for 2 years. She married one of her ladies-in-waiting to a nobleman in Elizabeth's court, and also she got very heavily in debt, borrowing large sums of money from our same John Dimmock, who had to appeal to the Swedish royal family for reimbursements. Not getting anywhere with Elizabeth, in 1565, Eric married his mistress, a commoner, and that's when the Swedish proposals finally stopped. But it wasn't the end of the story. In 1568, Eric was incarcerated with his wife by his half-brother Johann, the Duke of Finland. He took over the crown as the new King Johann of Sweden. In 1562, Johann married the daughter of the Polish king, Katarina of Jagiellon, and he tried to turn Sweden from a Protestant country, from a very young Protestant country, back into a Catholic country. So this was perceived so bad for England that Elizabeth even took part in a plot to rescue Eric from prison. But the plot failed, and to prevent any more attempts, because this was the third attempt, to rescue his brother, Johann had Eric poisoned in 1577. Now, why am I telling you all this? Because I see an early and until now an undetected layer of Love's Labour's Lost that captures English, Russian, and Swedish relations, as well as the secret marriage negotiations of the 1560s. So the first quotation from Love's Labour's Lost is an obscure comment about someone brooking the weather but unable to handle the wind. And this is almost word for word what was said about Eric's braving the elements, trying to sail to England, but unable to make it because of strong winds. 4 years after Johann, Duke of Finland, returned from England back home, he was imprisoned by Eric, his half-brother, for fear of treason. This was done on the advice of Eric's favorite advisor, Göran Persson. Johann hated Göran Persson with all his might because he was imprisoned because of him, because Göran ordered all Johann's loyal subjects to be killed, and for another personal reason. Well, apparently, before he married the Polish princess, Johann had several illegitimate children with his mistress, a commoner by the name of Karin Hansdotter. Their older daughter, Sophia, she'd grown up here, but she was a child at the time, she lived with her mother in Finland. After his marriage to Katarina of Jagiellon, Johann took Sophia from Finland to live with him and with his new wife in their Swedish household. But during Johann's imprisonment, which followed a year later, Jörgen Persson forced Sophia to stay in his household, separating her from her father. So, when Johann became the King of Sweden in 1568, it was his opportunity to revenge himself on Persson. He did it in a rather unconventional way. Johann had Persson tied up and got his guards to kill Persson by piercing him with daggers and knives and any sharp object they could find. So, just for comparison, it must have looked something like this. So now let's look at a quote in Love's Labour's Lost. God give you good morrow, Master Persson, shouts Jaquanetta, the base wench, as she runs in with a letter which she says is from Don Adriano di Armado. She wants the parson, Sir Nathaniel, to read it to her. Nathaniel or Holofernes, it depends which edition you're looking at, is very curious, and he says, Master Persson, quasi-person, and if one should be pierced, which is the one? So in the explanation, which I found in the modern version of Love's Labour's Lost, I worked for my book, 2009 Cambridge University edition, the editor says that Persson is, I quote, Jaquanetta's rustic pronunciation of the word parson. But now that you know the story about Eric's favorite person, and you know the manner of his death, I think you can see that Shakespeare is punning on Joran Pearson's name and the manner of his death. Don Armado, in the play, is after two women, the princess and Jaquanetta, to whom he writes a love letter. As you know, I believe that Armado is modeled on Ivan the Terrible. While waiting for Elizabeth to answer his marriage proposal, Ivan also inquired about a Scandinavian wife. First, he demanded that Eric ship him the wife of his brother Johann, the Polish Catalina of Jagiellon. But when Eric didn't cooperate, Ivan wrote a letter to Johann asking him about the availability of his illegitimate daughter Sophia, the one who used to live in Finland with her mother. In Sweden, Sophia's name, she was known as Sophia Johans daughter, which is Swedish for daughter of Johann. And Johann is John in English. However, in Finland, because Finnish is a different language from Swedish, she was called Sophia Juhanintita, meaning daughter of Juhanin or Johan, which is Swedish for John or Johan. Finnish for John, Juhanin or Johan. So the name Jaquanetta in Love's Labour's Lost is not a real French name. It is a composite name made out of French male name Jacques and a feminine Finnish suffix which indicates daughter of. So give Jacques' daughter a Finnish patronymic suffix tita, and what do you get? You will get a half French, half Finnish Jaquanetta, pronounced Jaquanetta if you had to pronounce it in English. So Shakespeare couldn't put a Finnish name into a French play, but he could hint at it, and I think Elizabeth would instantly understand who this base wench Jaquanetta was supposed to represent. So now you understand why Jaquanetta is greeting Master Person, why she asks a parson to read her a love letter from Don Armado, Ivan, but one last Swedish point, why should there be a choice as to who should be pierced? Because remember, we had this question. And if one should be pierced, which is the one? Well, in May of 1567, King Eric XIV suffered a kind of mental breakdown. He ran into prison where he kept his nobleman, Niels Sture, whom he put away for the suspicion of treason. He ran into prison and he stabbed Sture. Then he ran out and ran into the forest. His tutor, Boreas, ran after him, trying to calm him down, and Eric stabbed his tutor, Boreas, as well. In English court, at court, they knew Niels Sture because, as I told you, he was staying for almost a year in English court in 1561. So that is why we have this question as to who should be pierced. Should it be Niels Sture? Should it be Dionysius Boreas? Or should it be Joran Pearson? So this early layer of Love's Labour's Lost, as I see it, and pardon my pun, is a stab at Eric, at his favorite, at his tutor, at Johann III, at Johann's illegitimate daughter Sophia. And now do we wonder why, in Love's Labour's Lost, after watching the king and his men dressing up as Russians, about to go on stage, Boyer runs in to report what he saw to the princess, who represents Elizabeth, and says to her, "Oh, I'm stabbed with laughter." Okay, we're going to move on now. So after Edward de Vere moved in with the Cecils, he couldn't help but being exposed to discussions of the trials and tribulations of the Muscovy Company in their trade with Russia. As mentioned, the Muscovy Company was founded in 1555, 2 years after the discovery of Russia, and it was the first organization to contribute to England's trading and colonizing endeavors in the 16th and 17th centuries. William Cecil was one of its founding members. The company always found a sympathetic air in him, because whenever they needed to ask him a favor or request for a redress from the Queen, in letters addressed to him, he was called the company's patron and best friend. Cecil was one of the 27 peers in Mary Tudor's government who were the company's original members. They included people like, and you can see we have the grandfather of the two brethren to whom the first folio is dedicated, the grandfather of Philip Sidney and Mary Herbert Sidney. We have the brother-in-law of William Cecil, Sir Nicholas Bacon, who is also Lord Keeper of the Seal.
You're off by one slide.
Sorry? Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Not my computer. Okay. So we have the grandfather of the third Earl of Southampton here. And John Dimmock is among the members. And I know what you want to ask. Was John de Vere also a member? Ask me afterwards, because I'm worried I'm not going to even squeeze in what I have for you in the allotted time. So, in addition, Leicester and Walsingham became the members of the company under Queen Elizabeth. So here are more names that I want to throw in. John Dee, he's not mentioned as a member, but he's the one who provided the maps and the charts for the 1553 voyage, as he did for Frobisher's voyages later on. Then we have Thomas Lodge, is one of the original members, and he was the governor of the Muscovy Company in 1561. Then, talking of fellow poets, Christopher Marlowe's relative, Anthony Marlowe, or Marlowe, was a member and the chief agent of the Muscovy Company twice, in 1593 and in 1598. His brother, Anthony Marlowe's brother, invested in Frobisher voyages, and his widow, when she got married for the third time, she purchased Edward de Vere's house, one of his mansions. Okay, so more names that will ring a bell with you. Sir John Yorke, the master of the mint and an expert in foreign currency, former alderman of London, former sheriff of London. So it is in his garden that the meeting between Lady Mary Hastings, if you remember her, and Ivan's third ambassador, Fyodor Pisemsky, took place in May of 1583. John Yorke had 11 sons. At the time of composing his will in 1562, 6 of them were still alive: Peter, Henry, William, Roland, Edward, and Edmund. It is the same Edmund Yorke to whom, in June of 1574, Edward de Vere, just before sailing off on his secret departure from England, he granted a 42-year lease of one of his manors to Edmund. Edmund was also related to de Vere by marriage, and in 1591 he served as a special ambassador to France, and certainly was in a position to supply the more detailed knowledge of French affairs that we see in Love's Labour's Lost. As for Edward Yorke, Oxford stayed with him at York House when he returned from the continent in 1576. The third brother, Roland, according to Shakespeare by another name, was the infamous Iago from Othello. 2 more key people of the Muscovy Company: Michael Locke. We know his association with Oxford and the Frobisher ventures. But I don't know if you're aware that Locke served as the London agent for the Muscovy Company in 1571, then 1574, 75, and 76. In this capacity, he was responsible for every shipment of goods to Russia, for receiving the incoming cargoes of the imported things from Russia, for checking every item that went on board. It means that every yard of cloth and every hogshead of brimstone, which was needed to make gunpowder, had to be reported to him. Love's Labour's Lost teems with expressions about arms, lead, cannons, and so on, which traditional scholars usually attribute, take it as a symbol of the war of wits between the men and women in Love's Labour's Lost. With his knowledge about Elizabeth supplying half the world with military supplies, is it surprising that the Earl of Oxford desired to obtain a monopoly of trade on tin, which is one of the main ingredients of gunpowder? Now, another person of importance to us is Rowland Hayward, the governor of the Muscovy Company 4 times, just unheard of, 4 times. In 1593, Edward de Vere bought Hayward's house in Hackney. This house, known as King's Place, or Brook House, where de Vere spent the last 11 years of his life, was purchased from the longest-serving governor of the Muscovy Company. Next group of people. Oops, I think I skipped. English envoys to Russia. Now, they were another good source of information about Russia, and most of them participated in other high-ranking domestic state offices, and all these people were connected to Edward de Vere. They were either his friends, fellow writers, or members of parliament whom he inevitably would meet. Now, I only have time to tell you about two of them. And they are Thomas Randolph and Jerome Horsey. So Thomas Randolph was one of the ablest diplomats. He was sent in 1568 to Russia to respond to Ivan's verbal messages brought by Anthony Jenkinson. And they were touching the shipment of arms, Ivan's request for political alliance, and Ivan's marriage proposal to Elizabeth. Randolph took back to Russia Elizabeth's permission for asylum that Ivan requested in case there was a coup against him in Russia. In one of his letters to Burleigh, Randolph revealed that in Russia, I quote, "heads go routinely to the pot," end of quote, and that Ivan's nobles, I quote, "have been cut in pieces by his commandment," end of quote. Randolph might have been responsible for the quotes referring to roasting and dismemberment in Love's Labour's Lost. Randolph spent more time than anyone else with Pisemsky, a Russian envoy, when the latter was in England in 1582 and 1583. He was present during Pisemsky's meeting with Walsingham, Leicester, and Huntington in November 1582, and he played a central part during Pisemsky's viewing of the prospective bride, Lady Mary Hastings, during the meeting in May 1583 at York House, the house of the Master of the Mint, John York. Randolph had known Edward de Vere since Edward was 12 years old, and in one of his letters, Oxford addresses Randolph as, I quote, "my very loving friend," and then he signed the letter with "your loving friend, Edward Oxenford." Sir Jerome Horsey. If there was one Englishman who truly had inside information about 16th century Russia, it was Horsey. Horsey spent almost 20 years shuttling back and forth between England and Russia, I have identified at least 3 references to him in Love's Labour's Lost. He's the central figure in the story of Ivan's courtship of Lady Mary. He carried Ivan's letter to Elizabeth in the horse's mane across Europe. The citation in Love's Labour's Lost, "A horse is an ambassador for an ass," refers to him, and I can confirm this because in a letter Hosi wrote to Tsar Boris Godunov that I saw in the Russian archives, he signed his name with the depiction of a little horse. Hosi reported Ivan's interest in alchemy. He prompted the mention of Mercury in Act 5 of Love's Labour's Lost. The play draws on details of Hosi's descriptive image of Ivan for his depiction of Don Armado, the way Ivan walks, the way he talks, and so on. Hosi's memoir, Travels of Sir Jerome Hosi, was the most abundant source for the Russian material that appeared in Love's Labour's Lost. The trouble is that unlike the works of some other envoys, Hosi's travels were never published during Shakespeare's lifetime. They remained in manuscript form, and they were only edited for the very first time in 1856 by Edward Bond, who was a librarian in the British Library. Hosi is also buried in the parish of Great Kimble that used to belong to the Earls of Oxford. So there are Russian language expressions and English sentences modeled on their Russian equivalents. Of course, we don't have time to examine them now, but they only could come from the works of people like Hosi, Fletcher, who collected Russian words, and also from Vere's direct observation of the Russian envoys at court. So the first 3, number 1 through number 3, all feature in Love's Labour's Lost. Of course, Ivan Mikulin was in London already after the publication of the first quarter of Love's Labour's Lost, so I'm not mentioning him. But he did leave in his report to Boris Godunov very interesting details about Essex uprising, something I'm still to write about. Okay, so not too bad. I'm moving to the last and perhaps the least expected source of information about Russia, to the Earl of Oxford, and that's Anne Vavasor. Biron, in Love's Labour's Lost, admits that poet never writes unless he's in a throe of passion. I speculate that the Earl of Oxford was writing Love's Labour's Lost, its main layer, because there are many layers there, as you can see, at the height of his passion for Anne Vavasor. Their son, Edward Vere, was born in March of 1581, which means he was conceived in the summer of 1580, when Elizabeth and her court were on progress in East Anglia. We know what happened next. They had to part, and the parting was not of their own making. Love's Labour's Lost ends with the song of Vere. It speaks about the time of daisies and other flowers, and the young maidens having to bleach their dresses, while obviously hinting at their frolicking in the fields of wildflowers. The final words about the words of Mercury and the song of winter signal the return to unwanted reality, perhaps a nod to the Queen's order for him to return to Aunt Cecil. The poem, Though I Seem Strange, is attributed to Anne Vavasor. As I see it, both this painting and the poem are linked to Love's Labour's Lost. So, forced to hide her love, Anne confesses, so where I like, I least not want my love. Where I desire, there I must fain debate. One has my hand, another has my glove, but he my heart, whom most I seem to hate. In other words, her heart remains with De Vere, To me, this painting is highly symbolic. This excessively numerous flowers on her dress are not a sign of her bad taste, but a tribute, kind of a nod to their time together, the time of wine and daisies, so to speak. Now, look at her, the words about the hands and gloves. One has my hand, another has my glove. Gloves can signify several things. They could represent the concealment, or they can also be used to signify courtly love. A lady would give her glove as a sign of favor to her knight, who was to fight in her honor and for her love. We know about her attachment to Sir Henry Lee. He was known to appear tilt in armor which was etched all over with her initials, AV. So let's assume that Sir Henry Lee is her knight. He is the one who has her glove. But who has her hand? In other words, who is the man she married? And what does this all have to do with Russia? Well, the man she married was John Finch. In some documents, he is referred to as a captain of a ship. But whether or not he was, he sailed to Russia in 1583 as a servant to an English envoy, Sir Jerome Bowes. Bowes had to explain to Ivan why Lady Mary Hastings couldn't marry him. Bowes and Finch would be on Elizabeth's and her advisor's lips in 1584 because things didn't go well for Bowes and Finch in Russia. Ivan's Anglophobic counselors hated Bowes hated Bowes, and Finch too, but Bowes especially because he was the ambassador. On 19th March of 1584, when Ivan died that day, his counselors walked into Bowes' room and said they were debating whether to dismember him or just to throw him out of a window. Now, he escaped death only due to the intervention of Jerome Horsey, who also happened to be in Russia at the time, and he had a very special relationship with Boris Godunov at the time. Things changed later. Upon their return to England to justify his botched mission to Russia, Bowes lied about their time in Russia and also lied about Horsey, who had actually helped Bowes to escape. When Horsey returned and told his side of the story, Bowes and Finch were called in to tell the truth in a court hearing. Finch unconvincingly stuck to the fabricated story about nearly being roasted in Russia. However, under pressure from William Cecil, Finch quickly cracked and confessed. Burleigh is recorded as saying that it was lucky for Finch not to have been roasted in Russia, but he also said, looking at Finch, "'Tis a pity, Sirrah, that you were not a little bit scorched." So Anne Vavasor had another source of information about Russia in the person of Henry Lee's half-brother, Sir Richard Lee, an old hand in Russian affairs. It is believed he spent 2 years in Russia in the early 1580s, and he was also chosen as an ambassador to Russia again in 1599. But to get back to Anne Vavasor as a source of information, what relevance would this have if she and Oxford never saw each other after 1581? Because if that was the case, she couldn't pass on to him any Russia-related news that she would obtain from Finch or Richard Lee. So by showing you the next painting, I want to suggest that they did see each other after the breakup. The portrait was anonymous, but later it was renamed Mary Senhouse, whose father died in 1605, which is the date on the painting. She wears a mourner's bonnet, but she doesn't wear a black mourning dress, as one would expect if she just lost her husband or her father. Just an example of another painting by the same painter, another lady in mourning, the same cap on her, but black dress. Now, I believe that this painting of Mary Senhouse is misattributed, because I believe it's another portrait of Anne Vavasor. Anne Vavasor also had reason to mourn because she lost De Vere in 1604. She wouldn't wear a widow's mourning dress because they were not married, but she could have worn a mourning hat, a cap for him. Notice they also have the same chain in both paintings. Now, in her right hand, she's holding, in the right hand, she's holding a little red book with ties. It looks like a commonplace book, a kind of 16th century scrapbook, in which one would write down aphorisms or some interesting information they found in other books, maybe poems of one's own composition, or those copied from elsewhere. Now, please help me. This is the question. Is this the same book that I see? So is it the same book that I see in his hands too? Because the books, to me, seem very identical. And there was no mass printing. There was no Office Depot in those days. Did Anne Vavasor inherit his book? Or did they write in it? Did they own it together? Did they write in it jointly? This would explain the confusion we now have about the authorship of the echo poem. Is it De Vere's? Is it Anne Vavasor's? So if this is the same notebook, I'd like to suggest that they were, so to speak, on the same page post-1581, if only for the sake of their son. So today we examine just some of the sources of information about Russia available to the author of Love's Labour's Lost. I hope you agree with me that they shed some light on the authorship question as well as on the dating of Love's Labour's Lost and its new dimension. It seems clear that the author must have been a court insider, and Edward de Vere, to my mind, remains the strongest candidate for all the reasons I have just explained. Thank you very much.
So we've got probably time for one question. If there's one out there, I'm happy to run out. Okay, your hand's up.
Great presentation,
Thank
Rima.
you. Thank you.
We see Russians in All's Well That Ends Well too, don't we?
Sorry, in where?
In All's Well That Ends Well, isn't that?
Yes,
there are
that's
Russians
true.
as well.
That's
Another
true.
reference to Russia. I'm curious about Eva Turner Clark's book on Love's Labour's Lost, and she finds allusions to Elizabeth's progress in 79 or 80, as well as European politics. Are those additional layers that you accept, or are you proposing
No,
this?
I see it more from the Russian side.
Okay.
I think her explanations tend to work for one time, historical time, but then something else doesn't quite fit in. It's not that I think that each one of my points is the smoking gun. Right. I just think that together they fit in terms of timeline. I just see Love's Labour's Lost as a sort of overview of Russia's relations, but now I'm also seeing earlier layer too, and it's also Russia, but it's through Russia's relations with Finland and also with Denmark, but I didn't have time to tell you about it today.
Next time.
Next time, promise.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.